Welcome to the GSMC Business News Podcast, the show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. If you're looking for a podcast to keep you informed and ahead of the game in business, the GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Business News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Paula DuPont, and again, we're talking about business news and what that means to you, what that means to all of us. So we have several very diverse items to talk about today, and I'm just going to give you a little rundown, a little taste of what we're going to talk about. First, we're going to talk about healthcare and how the industry is responding and providing some relief to hospitals and doctors in practices or in areas that are not necessarily directly dealing with the coronavirus. We're then going to talk about the automotive industry and some recent impacts and announcements that have come out of that industry. We're going to talk about Quibi, which I mentioned in another podcast that it has launched this week. And it had me thinking after I talked about it that, perhaps it means a change for us as viewers and the kind of entertainment we like. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. And then kind of related to that, we're going to talk about how internet habits have changed and what we're doing a little differently as a result of this pandemic, which we can all agree is kind of an extraordinary time and has changed us in subtle and perhaps large ways as well. Then in our last segment, we're going to talk about 3D printing, and then finally about a little perk that Apple workers are getting. So hopefully end on a lighter note and one that I'm a little jealous of, but maybe that's not everybody, but we'll get to that later. So, as I said, we're going to begin with talking about some help that's on the way for the healthcare industry. And let me just say that recently when I was talking to a friend and telling them about another friend's experience with her mother being in the hospital with the coronavirus and the extraordinary impact that a nurse had on my friend and her family and her mother when this nurse used her own phone and sat with the patient, sat with her mother to do a Zoom conference with the family, giving her a chance to see everybody that all at the same time. And it really struck me how those kinds of things you can't spell out to a healthcare worker to do and ask them to provide that kind of care. That comes from somewhere else. That comes from within and a deep dedication to your job and to people. And I think we all would like to see some way to help those in the industry and not have to suffer any kinds of stresses from financial difficulties. In this story that I'm going to talk about, it's not necessarily one that would impact a nurse there on the front line, but it does help provide some relief overall to hospitals who are going to be facing the steep bills and the gap between getting reimbursed by insurance companies and being able to pay expenses. So United Health Group, a large insurance company that covers about $150 billion a year in healthcare costs, has announced that it is going to accelerate payments to doctors and hospitals in this time frame and fast track it, starting with about $2 billion over the next week to ease the cash crunch that healthcare providers have experienced because they've had to furlough workers amid the coronavirus. An article recently in the Wall Street Journal said that the move by the biggest U.S. insurer to hasten claims payments, which it said would last for the duration of the crisis, could shave weeks off the time it takes for some providers to get paid for a service. Typically, contracts allow for payment within 30 days. Doctors and hospitals are under financial pressure because many are seeing a sharp drop-off in regular visits and emergency room trips and surgeries essential to their bottom lines. Hospitals have canceled many procedures to clear out space and preserve scarce protective gear as they brace for an influx of patients infected by the new coronavirus. So a lot of those items and the financial pressure that it has caused for doctors and hospitals is something that the American Hospital Association was looking to provide some relief for, and they wrote a letter and sent it to the major providers asking for them to consider some sort of accelerated payment for this help. And so that is one provider, United Healthcare, that is answering that call. Now, the Trump administration had said on Friday that it will pay hospitals to treat uninsured coronavirus patients through that federal stimulus package. Providers will not be allowed to bill the uninsured because of that, because they will get reimbursed through the federal government. But overall, I think that any relief, most of us can get behind any relief that can be provided to that industry, just so that they can continue to focus on dealing with this pandemic. Another area that's been impacted similarly in general are the medical tech stocks. They're seeing a hit to their stock price because, as we said, hospital operations lately have been thrown for a loop. For years, hospitals and large physician practices had a steady, predictable income and sales and profits. The coronavirus has scrambled that, and now hospitals have been faced with suspending elective procedures to help deal with this surge in dealing with the pandemic. Elective procedures can be anything from cosmetic surgery, like a nose job, to hip replacement or knee replacement. So that has hurt some of the medical technology companies who help support those types of procedures, and they're facing it as well. And I guess they're bracing right now that there may be continued impact even as we start to flatten the curve of the virus. The continuing surge in unemployment will also likely lead to a decline of patients with private health insurance, which typically reimburses hospitals at far higher rates than do Medicare and Medicaid. That's something that I read from the Wall Street Journal also. The uncertainty makes it unlikely that hospitals will be comfortable investing in new equipment in the near term. So that's something that, again, we're going to see more fallout from in the months ahead. I wonder, too, with more people being unemployed, if people will put off procedures because of that and maybe an effect that they have to their own health insurance. And so we'll just have to see what happens on that front. But at least you have insurance companies, as I said, United Healthcare stepping up, and then the stimulus package that will provide some relief. So all in all, I think that there is some positive outreach to help the hospitals who we all sympathize for. So coming up in our next segment, we're going to talk about the auto manufacturing business and how that's being impacted. There's some headlines that have been coming out lately, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So stay tuned, and I'll be back in a second.
Are you looking for a podcast that gives you all of the latest news from the world of finance? Then check out the GSMC Financial News Podcast. We'll delve into the ups and downs of the stock market, changes in the economy, and news from the world of real estate and technology. From breaking news on the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, or the overseas market, to updates on the bond market, if there's money to be made, we'll cover it on the GSMC Financial News Podcast.
Hi, I'm back. I told you I would be. So, in this segment, we're going to talk about the impacts to the auto manufacturing industry. And this is something that I guess because of other headlines I've seen in recent weeks about GM partnering with another company, I believe Medtronic, to make ventilators using one of its production plants and about 1,000 of its workers to be able to do that. And then when that came out, there was also some talk by Tesla and Ford to also get into the ventilator production business, at least in terms of supporting the current need and demand. And so I thought it was going to be kind of a lemonade story about how this industry was able to transform itself in order to not only survive, but also provide a really valued item commodity for us right now. Those things are still going on, and ventilators are being made. However, with what's happening in car sales being down, several of the car manufacturers have had to make cuts. Tesla just announced that it has to furlough 10,000 workers at its California plant. It only has the one plant in California, and it has announced that it would be cutting salaried employees' pay more than 2 weeks after it was forced to shut down production at its California plant. Tesla said it hoped to resume vehicle production on May 4th in California, a day after the local government shutdown is supposed to be lifted. U.S. salaried employees will see their pay temporarily reduced between 10 and 30%, depending on their position, while non-U.S. employees will get comparable reductions. Cutbacks are supposed to go into effect on Monday. The company is also furloughing employees without pay who can't work from home or who haven't been assigned to critical work. And they all workers will receive their company health care benefits. Tesla had stopped making vehicles back on March 23rd. Nissan Motor Company and Honda Motor Company, two of the largest car makers in Japan, also announced that it was furloughing their U.S. factory workers without pay this week. Nissan said it affects about 10,000 hourly workers in their Tennessee and Mississippi operations, where they have been furloughed until late April. Honda has said it has 14,400 factory workers who will be furloughed until production resumes at the earliest May 1st. These layoffs or furloughs add to the bigger picture where the U.S. auto industry has mostly shut down since the beginning of March. General Motors, Ford, Fiat, Chrysler, together they have about 150,000 hourly workers who have been furloughed. Some of those workers, however, are protected by the United Auto Workers Union. That doesn't necessarily apply to some of the foreign-owned manufacturers. However, affected workers at both Honda and Nissan can apply for enhanced unemployment benefits from the government, and both companies have said that their workers will retain benefits such as health care. So I think there is an expectation that that once the lines start again, everyone will be called back and back at regular pay. Right now, it's not. We just don't know when that will be. In March, by the way, U.S. car sales fell nearly 40% from last year at this time. So that's a pretty significant hit. I'm not in any way trying to minimize the impact of these furloughs to auto workers. I can't imagine what they're feeling, having their livelihoods put on hold. But it seems to me that is exactly what it is. It's put on hold. I think in the past when we've heard about deep cuts in the auto industry or in any manufacturing industry, it came at a time when we were in a recession or facing a bigger economic problem. And right now, we know that this is the result of, again, an extraordinary circumstance, a 1 in 100 event of a pandemic, although I think it's a little longer than that. Somebody should have told us, I guess people who've written books about pandemics have told us that these happen every 100 years or so. So this is ours, and we know that this will pass. We know that overall we're in a better place than our country was in past pandemics. If this had happened, maybe 20 years ago even, we wouldn't have had the ability to do so much telecommuting and getting so much information from multiple sources. So even just getting the word out to everyone to stay home, to wash your hands as often as possible, to cover your mouth, to limit your social activity. If that was the case 20 or more years ago, yes, we would have found out, but that was if you tuned into the news at 6 or 11 and you'd get that information. Now we get that information everywhere we go, on our phones, computers, emails that we get from our local government to give us updates. So we get a lot of information, and I know I'm going off on a tangent here, but we're in a better place at this time in some regards. And in terms of coming out of this, of course we don't know for sure how long it's going to take for us to rebound, but we at least know the reasons why we're in the situation we are from a work perspective. And so I'm at least feeling hopeful that workers will be back on the production lines in the months ahead, hopefully month ahead, and not much longer. But even if it is longer, it's not going to last forever. So I think it's just important to kind of keep things in perspective and not feel that they are such doom and gloom, and that we'll be out of work indefinitely. Hopefully, in that industry, they probably have more assurances than others that they'll be back at work. So, just my 2 cents. Anyway, we are going to be taking a break. And when we come back, we are going to talk about Quibi. That's the new mobile app that was launched this week after a lot of promotion and some fanfare. Not quite as much fanfare as maybe if we weren't in a pandemic. But nonetheless, a lot of you have heard about it already. Maybe a lot of you already have it downloaded on your phone. And we're going to talk about that in a minute and what kind of new trends that might signal. So I'll see you in a few seconds.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
Hi, I'm back, and as I said before, we're going to talk about Quibi. A couple days ago, I mentioned that it was launching this week, and so it has. And with its launch, I believe it offers a 90-day free trial period. And in a lot of ways, what better time to launch something than right now, when you find most people are staying at home and don't have a whole lot of other things going on besides work, besides teaching the kids, besides checking up on everyone. Well, I guess we do have some things to do. But in any case, it does provide another type of entertainment for us. So Quibi is quick bites of entertainment, video entertainment. It was designed specifically for smartphones. And from what I understand, it has put a lot of attention to detail in designing it to be seen either in landscape or portrait mode on your phone. And the quality is supposed to be really good. They have quality programming. They have a lot of original programming. They've spent some money on some superstars and developing programs for Liam Hemsworth and Chrissy Teigen, just to name a couple. And so by now you've probably seen a lot of the advertising for it. You know about it. You might even have it on your phone already. And what I've been thinking about since it launched was, I guess, a couple things. One is, it's interesting that it launches now and it's aimed to an audience of people on the go. That's who it was designed for, and that's why it was designed to view primarily from a smartphone rather than watching from a computer. You can watch it from a computer, I believe, but it's really designed for smartphones and for people on the go. And let's face it, a month ago, we were people on the go, and we were impatient, and we had to stand in lines, and we were in crowds of people, waiting to check out, or waiting to, I don't know if going to the bank is a good analogy. Not a lot of us do that anymore, but there's any number of things that we do where we're standing in line, or we're waiting for something, or otherwise not engaged in active thinking and have an opportunity to be engaged. And where some of us might check messages on our phones, now here's an opportunity to actually watch a video program that is no more than 10 minutes in length. And it's described as being like chapters of a movie. So instead of, watching a series where you would download not download, but you would get the whole series. You could go from one episode to the next rather seamlessly like you do on Netflix. This is something where there's a succinct end and a chapter type approach to the story. So I can see its benefits and the allure of it. It's just that, again, if you go back to what our lives were like up to about a month ago and what our lives are like now, we're not really on the go as much. And a little later, we're going to talk about some trends that have come out of this new lifestyle that we've had to embrace for the past few weeks, depending on where you live and when those policies went into place about staying at home. So it's interesting timing about that. But I guess what I also wondered about was this short form of entertainment. Is this something that we're all looking for? We're now out of binge watching, or that's not as popular. It seems that it is, from what we know about Netflix and the success that they've had with many of their series. But it just seems like such an extreme change to that. And maybe this is not necessarily an alternative to watching things like Netflix, which are pretty much more designed to watch on your TV at home. Of course, you can watch it on your computer and on your phone, but it's really more for your living room. And this other platform, Quibi, is for on the go. But in terms of the type of programming, Netflix is in song titles and, Netflix and chill, and we have that whole new language because of Netflix and the way it sort of changed some of our habits around entertainment. So what is Quibi saying? And what's the opposite of binge watching? I was thinking about this. What's the term? I haven't heard it yet. Maybe I just haven't heard it and it's out there. Is it nibbling? Sampling, noshing. I don't know. I mean, what can you equate having just a quick bite of something? Drive through? I don't know. Who cares, right? But it does make me think about, what the future of TV entertainment is going to be. And, I guess we'll have to wait and see what the results are like. I've heard some good things about Quibi and the kind of programs that it has. But I have not had a chance to look at it myself because I've been busy. I'm busy working on podcasts for one thing and other stuff too. But, I'm curious if anyone who's listening to this has an opinion and what this says about our natures and our habits, and if we're going to go that route. And by the way, another interesting thing about how Quibi is doing this is that where they have a series of programs, you can't binge watch them if you decided to spend an hour or two to watch the whole series. They will only upload one program a day or one episode a day. So you can probably watch it in a week or so, but it's not all at once. So it's really changing the way that we view programs, at least in this shorter format. And they're not the first ones to do that. Adult Swim did that with some late night programming that it had. And actually Netflix started to do that last year. They started taking a look at some of their programs and trying to do some shorter form ones. Not quite as short as 10 minutes, but maybe 12 to 17 minute episodes. With a couple programs that they introduced. So it's not totally new, but it is for this platform, as we said. So again, I'd be interested to get any feedback on that. So we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about how our internet habits have changed since the coronavirus. I'll be back in a moment.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
So, in our last segment, we were talking about changing trends in entertainment and new ways that we may possibly be looking at TV. So now I just want to turn our attention to a new study that the New York Times did and reported on, talking about how the virus has changed the way we internet. And some of the findings that have come out of it probably wouldn't be a big surprise to a lot of us. But some other things or some interesting observations that came out of it that make a lot of sense and I wouldn't have seen necessarily. And it will be interesting to see what of these changes will revert back to the way they were before when the virus has largely cleared out. What the study says is that it reveals that our behaviors have shifted, sometimes starkly, as the virus spread and pushed us to our devices for work, play, and connecting. One of their big observations is we are looking to connect and entertain ourselves, but are turning away from our phones, which is kind of interesting, especially what we talked about with Quibi just a minute ago, and how Quibi is geared to us using our phones. Again, that's for if we're on the go, and maybe since this is not that scenario, that's why we're not using our phones as much. With nearly all public gatherings called off, Americans are seeking out entertainment on streaming services like Netflix and YouTube, no surprise, and looking to connect with one another on social media outlets like Facebook. In the past few years, users of these services were increasingly moving to their smartphones, creating an industry-wide focus on mobile. Now that we are spending our days at home with our computers close at hand, we're not using our phones as much. We can now see things a little bit better on a bigger screen on our desk than we can just holding it in the palm of our hand. Facebook, Netflix, and YouTube have all seen user numbers on their phone apps stagnate as their websites have actually grown. So that's what the New York Times reports. They say with the rise of social distancing, we are seeking out new ways to connect, mostly through video chat. And that's consistent with what we've known with the rise of Zoom and how many people are using that, which is a video conferencing tool that enables people to connect for many different types of events online and live. So while traditional social media sites have been growing, it seems that we want to do more than just connect through messaging and text. We want to see one another. Makes sense. This is also a very anxious time, so it makes sense that we do want to have more of that kind of connection, especially when there's so many tools that enable us to do that pretty easily. This has given a big boost to apps that used to linger in relative obscurity, like Google's video chatting application, Duo, and House Party, which allows groups of friends to join a single video chat and play games together. Not surprisingly, we've seen an increase in the tools that we need to use while working at home or in teaching our kids. School assignments are being handed out on Google Classroom. Meetings are happening on Zoom, Google Hangouts, Microsoft Teams, and I've also used other tools like Blue Jeans. That's another one that's been used out there. We also, according to the New York Times, one of the other interesting observations is that despite all the negative news out there about the pandemic that we're hearing a lot, is that we're actually seeking that out. The search for updates on the virus has pushed up readership for local and established newspapers, but not partisan sites. The New York Times said, amid the uncertainty about how bad the outbreak could get, with the number of dead multiplying by the day, Americans appear to want few things more than the latest news on the coronavirus. Americans have also been seeking out more established media brands for information on the public health crisis and its economic consequences. CNBC, the business news site, has seen readership skyrocket. The websites for the New York Times and the Washington Post have both grown traffic more than 50% over the last month, according to their statistics from SimilarWeb, one of their analysis sites. And this is just my commentary, not part of the New York Times report, but if you're like me, you tune into at least one of the daily press conferences by either a governor, mayor, or the president's press conference that happen regularly each day. I have been doing that pretty much throughout, and I hear that there are other people that do, and it's interesting the ones that they choose. But according to, again, the New York Times article, they had said that really more than any of the news sites, the site that has had the most popularity is the homepage for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I think that's actually a pretty good thing, that people would go to the source for information, so that no matter where you are in the country, no matter what your local government's position is on the pandemic and the actions that are being taken, that in terms of the number and the effects of the virus, that you can go to the one source that is the most credible and can serve us all. And that's, of course, too, where a lot of the news programs are drawing from as well. So there, some interesting things that came out of this study that they did. Another thing that was kind of interesting was the fact that without sports going on right now, sites like ESPN have seen a big drop off, and I'm sure there's many more industries and sites that have been impacted by the lack of sports going on. But what's interesting is that there's a site that I just only recently heard of, and it's been around, is Twitch, and that is a leading site for streaming gameplay. And traffic to that site has gone up 20% since the start of the pandemic in this country. So basically, instead of watching March Madness or watching the start of baseball season or any of the other sports that would be going on right now, and I don't mean to spite any of this other sports. I know that there's many, hockey and many others. But instead of doing that, you can watch one of the best gamers in the industry play Call of Duty and be joined by thousands of other fans who would be watching as well. Just another quick note in terms of what the New York Times study said is that TikTok, the app that shows short clips of pranks and dance-offs and lip syncing, that app has continued to grow. It was growing anyway exponentially before the pandemic, but since that time has increased even more. So we're going to pause for commercial, and when we come back, we're going to talk about 3D printing.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Hi, we're back. And in this segment, we're going to talk about something a little different than some of the other topics that we've discussed, which were talked about the internet and impacts from the coronavirus. And there is a coronavirus take on this, but the bigger story is about something that was supposed to be a major disruptor in business and to the world that didn't exactly occur that way, but it is showing promise, and it's kind of raised to the surface now with the coronavirus. And I'm talking about 3D printing. I remember years ago, in fact, I think it's probably almost 9 years ago or so, there was an article in The Economist magazine. In fact, there was a picture on the cover of a 3D printed Stradivarius violin. And the article went on to talk about how 3D printing was going to revolutionize the world and would enable us to do all kinds of things, basically on demand. And it was quite extraordinary because when you consider the kind of perfection that goes into making a Stradivarius violin, one of the best known and best quality instruments that there can be in the world. It was quite a feat, and for all the things that this article was promising, and other publications as well that looked at 3D printing were promising, it seemed like we were going to see something relatively soon. It was thought that we would have micro-manufacturing and products on demand. And I think one of the examples that I remember was talking about you could custom order sneakers with your design and be able to have it printed and delivered to you in a relatively short time. So that didn't quite happen, not at least not that quickly. It is being used, it's being developed even more. But one of the areas that has seen a big use for it has been museums and cultural institutions. Some of them around the world have been looking to 3D printing as a way to replicate either historic or ancient sites or artwork or scenes that would otherwise be too difficult to be able to show people, show museum visitors. One of the examples that was given was King Tut's tomb in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. And there was a replica made of the tomb that allows tourists to experience the inside of the king's tomb without harming the original burial site. So this is kind of a unique use for 3D printing that we couldn't have seen, but it really gives us an opportunity to see things that we wouldn't otherwise get to see. So it seems a new frontier of sorts for 3D printing to be used in this way to support cultural institutions and museums, and exploring all the possibilities there to replicate things that otherwise wouldn't be able to be accessible to visitors and historians. However, there is a new use of 3D printing that you may have heard about already, and that's with making PPE, personal protective equipment. And I've heard that there are a number of companies that are doing that, and I believe that there's the designs that are developed to program the printers, that there's some open sharing going on with that, so that anybody with the technology could use these plans to make some of these devices. One of the places where this is happening is on some college campuses, where they're using 3D printers as sort of emergency producers of masks, visors, and other protective gear that can be used at the hospitals. Cornell University, at Cornell, their production of visors began soon after a professor there received an urgent email asking for a 3D personal protective equipment and was looking for donations for the Cornell Medical Center branch in New York City. And so they answered that call by kind of taking over the 3D printers that were available, any one of them that could be commandeered, in order to start to create some of this PPE. An article in the Verge publication talked about how Cornell University had kind of risen to the challenge, and in the article stated that production escalated quickly after the school's College of Architecture, Art, and Planning, which houses many of the university's 3D printers, got involved. In an email to students in that department, the school announced that the college would be dedicating printers and resources to the cause, and asked for those with 3D printers at home and extra filament left over from the semester to be donated to producing materials for visors and other equipment. One of the items of the PPE are facial shields, and facial shields have been incorporated into PPE for frontline healthcare workers as a precaution against respiratory droplets that transmit the virus. The shields being produced by Cornell faculty and students consist of a plastic visor piece that is worn across the forehead and a sheet of disposable polyethylene, which the team has been laser cutting in the university's digital fabrication lab. Many students, caught within the strange limbo of a closed campus and a university transitioning to online instruction, volunteered to print the visor pieces from home. One of the students in the program who's working on the visors said that 3D printing is a small way to combat the sense of helplessness incited by the pandemic. These are trying times. We all should be trying to help in any way we can. It seems that our field, architecture, is not useful in this time of crisis, so doing what little I can feels necessary. One of the issues, I guess, with 3D printing and with this particular project is that it does take an awful long time to produce just one piece, as opposed to, in a larger factory setting. So it's one of those things where any little bit helps, and collectively all the students together were able to print, I believe it's over 500 visors, which they contributed or donated to the healthcare workers in New York City. They are still working at it, as far as I know at this time, and certainly a noble effort, and it gives people a chance to really do something to make a difference, and certainly they do need the PPE in New York City. So maybe we're back to where we were with some of the initial predictions about 3D printing, is that there's just all kinds of possibilities. And when you think about the extremes of whether you're printing a Stradivarius violin or you're printing a face shield, there seems to be endless opportunities for it. So we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back, and we're going to wrap up today's podcast talking about what it's like to be an Apple employee.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
So there was something in the news recently that caught my eye. It wasn't one of the more sensational headlines, but I guess it just caught my attention because it talked about Apple workers getting to take home unreleased devices, some of the new products that they're developing. And I thought, how cool is that to work for a company and have this cutting edge technology that the world's watching for and waiting for, and actually getting to bring it home and test it out from home. Now, of course, this isn't all employees. I'm sure it's only a select group of employees that do development and do testing for these new devices. But again, I thought it was just interesting because it just seems like that would be kind of a fun thing to do, to be able to check out these things and use them in the home environment. And one of the things that we've been kind of waiting on to see what will happen is that Apple is supposed to release their new, more affordable iPhone in the fall. And it's not clear whether they're still going to make that deadline or not, because they've had to shut down factories in China because of the coronavirus. Now, I'm not sure if those factories are back up and running right now. I've seen that a number of factories in China are back running again, and in fact recently reported that although they're ready to work and their factories are set up and workers are back, for some of the products that these plants make, the orders are coming in from Europe and other places, and not to the extent that they were before. In fact, a lot of orders have been canceled or put on hold because other countries are, of course, dealing with the coronavirus. So how that all impacts Apple, I don't know. I'm not even going to venture to guess. But meanwhile, for those employees working at the Cupertino headquarters in California, for those who are working from home, it's a time for them to still continue doing their work and try out these devices. This article that I saw said that Apple and other major tech companies have modified their business practices so workers can shelter in place and still move forward on projects, usually very secretive. The company allegedly is allowing unreleased devices to go home with workers for testing. One of the things that I saw with this news story was a picture of what looks to be an Apple Watch, but with a much longer screen that looks like it's curved to fit around your wrist. So I don't know if that's just a tease. Well, it probably is just a tease, but if that's what the new Apple Watch looks like, I'm thinking that might be for me. It seems pretty cool. This article was saying that taking home a device isn't something Apple is taking lightly. Apple employees must receive approval from a vice president before they are granted access. And the senior leadership also regularly reviews the employees' access to these devices. I mean, that's for obvious reasons and to make sure that they don't leak out to the public. When at-home testing is not possible, Apple is allowing some engineers to return to work on an as-needed basis to finish development. Apple is hoping these measures will help the company meet its target launch dates for this year. The company is allegedly working on new versions of the HomePod speaker, the Apple TV set box, the MacBook Pro, budget iPads, and Apple Watch, and an iMac for as early as later this year is one of the things that they supposedly are working on. It seems like an awful lot, and I'm sure when they set out to look at these launches this year, they hadn't expected that they were going to be shut down for a while, nor did probably anybody expect that we were going to be impacted like we were. The company is supposedly on track for the fall launch of its iPhones, despite a recent rumor suggesting they may be delayed by months. In addition to hardware, Apple also is making progress on the software front, with the releases of iOS 14 and Mac OS still on schedule. Similar to its hardware, Apple is controlling who has at-home access to its next-generation software releases. The article talks about how Apple, like a lot of companies, is dealing with the fact that, for their at-home employees, a lot of them are facing distractions and difficulties working from home. And one of the things that Apple's doing about that, I guess, as a morale booster, is to have employees send in photos of their home offices. Obviously, a volunteer activity. But it's just interesting because we've seen a lot with Zoom conferencing. We've seen what people's home offices look like, and it's been an interesting eye-opener, I think, for a lot of us. Incidentally, I saw recently that, I think it was last weekend, the Wall Street Journal did a 2-page spread with this floral type wallpaper that they said you could use for a background for a Zoom conference if you don't like the background in your office. So I thought that was kind of funny. I'm guessing if you're an Apple employee, you don't really have to worry too much about what's in the background in your home office. The important thing is working on those devices and doing your part to get them out to market. So this concludes another podcast of business news, and as we head into the last part of the week, I ask you please stay tuned, check in again. There is good news out there, and I'm going to find it, and I'm going to talk about it, and hopefully you'll join me and provide some comments back on our Facebook or Twitter post to let us know what you think. So take care and good night. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Business News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask you that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you and have a good night.
You've been listening to the GSMC Business News Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's podcast.